May 5th, 1945. The Kattegat, 12:43 in the afternoon. While the admirals in Flensburg were drafting surrender documents and the war in Europe ground to a jagged halt, one machine refused to stop. U-534 was a Type 9 C-40, a long-range oceanic predator designed to sever the supply arteries of the Atlantic. She was 252 feet of high-tensile steel, packed with diesel, torpedoes, and desperate men. Commander Herbert Nolau had ignored the fleet-wide order to surface and hoist the black flag of surrender. Instead, he ordered the engine room to give him maximum continuous revolutions. He was running north toward Norway, and he was not alone. High above the gray chop of the Danish waters, two consolidated B-24 Liberators of RAF Coastal Command locked onto the submarine's wake. One was E.I. Edward, 547 Squadron. The other was G. George, 86 Squadron. The anti-aircraft gunners on the aft deck of the U-boat opened fire, their 20mm shells tearing into the aluminium skin of the attacker. The U-boat's gunners shot down one bomber, E. Edward, but the kill bought only seconds. The second aircraft, G. George, pressed the attack and delivered the depth charges that ultimately sank U-534. A depth charge does not need to strike a submarine physically to kill it. Water is roughly 800 times denser than air, and unlike air, it is effectively incompressible. When a depth charge detonates underwater, the energy cannot dissipate into the atmosphere. It travels as a hammer of pressure. In the attack on U-534, one charge lodged on the casing just aft of the conning tower, then detonated beneath the hull. The physics were immediate and violent. The shockwave slammed into the pressure hull, a cylinder designed to resist the slow, crushing weight of the deep, not the sharp, dynamic impact of an explosion. The steel groaned and flexed beyond its elastic limit. In the stern, near the engine rooms, the hull integrity failed. The ocean forced its way in at a pressure of nearly 100 pounds per square inch. The weight of the inflowing water destroyed the boat's longitudinal stability instantly. The stern dropped, the bow rose. The submarine began a terminal slide backward, tilting to a 45-degree angle. Inside, the lights died. The air turned foul with the acrid stench of electrical fires and the terrifying hiss of high-pressure leaks. All 52 men escaped the submarine. 49 survived. But the machine itself continued its descent. It slid through the darkening water column, past the 100-foot mark, past the 150-foot mark. It impacted the seabed at 220 feet. The force of the landing drove the stern deep into the prehistoric clay of the ocean floor. The U-boat shuddered once, groaned as the internal bulkhead settled, and then went silent. For 48 years, the U-534 sat in the darkness. The currents of the Kattegat slowly draped her in a shroud of silt and fishing nets. She became a ghost story, a blip on the sonar of passing trawlers. But as the decades passed, the silence only amplified the mystery. Why had Nolau refused to surrender? Why did he run north when the war was over? Rumors began to circulate in the salvage bars of Rotterdam and Copenhagen. They whispered about Nazi gold bullion stacked in the officers' mess. They spoke of prototype jet engine plans and acoustic torpedoes that could change the balance of Cold War naval power. By 1993, the technology finally existed to answer the question. But the ocean does not give up its prizes willingly. The U-534 was no longer just a ship. She was a pressurized bomb. She was buried in sediment that acted like wet concrete, holding the hull with thousands of tons of suction force. And inside her corroding belly, the detonators on her torpedoes were becoming more unstable with every passing winter. If the salvage team wanted to know what Commander Nolau died trying to hide, they would have to lift 1,200 tons of unstable ordnance without cracking the hull or triggering a blast that would erase them from the surface of the sea. The mathematics of salvage operations are usually straightforward. You calculate the displacement of the vessel, add the weight of the water trapped inside, and apply a lifting force greater than the sum. But in the summer of 1993, the engineers planning the resurrection of U-534 were facing a variable that defied standard equations. That variable was the seabed itself. The floor of the Kattegat is not composed of clean, shifting sand. It is a thick, primordial sludge known as blue clay. This material is dense, cohesive and sticky. When a heavy object falls into it, the clay does not just support it, it swallows it. Over 48 years, the 1,200-ton hull of the U-boat had settled deep into this viscous matrix. The clay had formed a perfect vacuum seal around the steel belly of the submarine. To the salvage master, this meant the submarine did not weigh 1,200 tons. The physics of suction meant the effective weight was nearly double that. To pull the U-534 straight up would require a breakout force of over 2,000 tons. Applying that kind of raw tension to a corroded World War II hull would be catastrophic. The steel plates, weakened by half a century of saltwater electrolysis, would simply shear apart. The crane would rip the conning tower clean off, leaving the rest of the boat and its secrets embedded in the mud forever. But structural failure was only the second worst thing that could happen. The primary threat was far more volatile. The initial sonar scans and archival research confirmed that U-534 had left port fully loaded for war. In her tubes sat warshot torpedoes. These were not the simple contact detonator weapons of the First World War. Among them were T-11 Zaunkönig, 2 acoustic-homing torpedoes. The G7ES TXI, designed to home in on propeller noise. Explosives do not become safer with age. The chemical compounds in the warheads, typically hexenite, degrade over time. They can crystallize, becoming hypersensitive to friction and vibration. The salvage team was essentially standing on top of a submerged ammunition dump. If the breakout force was applied too violently, or if the hull flexed too much during the lift, the friction of steel grinding against steel could generate a spark inside the torpedo tubes. Water is an excellent conductor of shock waves. A detonation of just one warhead at a depth of 200 feet would create a bubble of expanding gas moving at supersonic speeds. It would vaporize the dive team instantly. It would send a hydraulic hammer blow straight up the lifting cables, potentially buckling the crane barge on the surface. The team from Smit Tak, the legendary Dutch salvage firm hired for the job, realized that brute force was not an option. They could not just drop a hook and pull. They had to perform a surgical extraction on a patient that weighed as much as a destroyer and was armed with unstable high explosives. They needed to break the vacuum of the blue clay without breaking the ship. The solution they engineered was a masterclass in patience. They would not grab the hull from the top. Instead, they would cradle it from the bottom. They planned to pass massive steel messenger cables underneath the keel, creating a sling that would distribute the lifting force across the entire length of the submarine. But to get those cables underneath the keel, someone had to go down there. The plan called for divers to descend to the pitch-black seabed and physically tunnel through the blue clay beneath the submarine. They would have to carve out narrow passages through the mud, directly under the crushing weight of the hull. It was a job that required nerves of steel and a total suppression of the survival instinct. The divers would be crawling into a hole with 1,200 tons of precarious steel above their heads, armed only with a high-pressure water hose. If the boat shifted even 6 inches, the tunnel would collapse, and the diver would become part of the wreckage forever. The engineering solution for lifting U-534 relied on a concept that seems paradoxical to the uninitiated, using water to cut through earth while underwater. To dig the tunnels beneath the submarine, the divers could not use shovels or mechanical excavators. The space was too tight, and the risk of striking a torpedo warhead with a metal tool was too high. Instead, they utilized high-pressure water lances, systems that fired a concentrated stream of seawater at pressures exceeding 3,000 pounds per square inch. This was not excavation, it was surgical erosion. The divers from Smit Tak descended into the darkness of the Kattegat, trailing umbilical cords that supplied them with breathing gas, communications, and hot water to keep their core temperature stable in the 38-degree cold. Upon reaching the seabed, they faced a wall of blue clay that rose up to swallow the steel hull. They had to lie flat on the ocean floor, insert the roaring water lance into the mud beneath the keel, and push themselves into the void they were creating. The visibility was zero. As soon as the water jet hit the clay, the ocean floor exploded into a dense cloud of particulate matter. The divers were working blind, guided only by the tactile feedback of the lance vibrating in their hands and the ominous, solid presence of the submarine's hull pressing down just inches above their helmets. They were burrowing like moles, but with one terrifying difference. Moles do not dig beneath 1,200 tons of unstable steel that has been waiting 50 years to collapse. The process was agonizingly slow. A diver would blast a small cavity, inch forward, and then pause to install a hydraulic jack or a wooden block to shore up the tunnel. They were building a bridge of sediment, inch by inch. The psychological strain was immense. At 220 feet, nitrogen narcosis is a constant enemy. Dulling the mind and slowing reaction times, every movement had to be deliberate. If a diver panicked and thrashed, they could dislodge the temporary supports, bringing the U-boat down on top of them. The physics of such an accident are grim. The human body is mostly water and can withstand pressure, but it cannot withstand the mechanical shear force of a falling submarine. Once a tunnel was completed, the team had to perform the delicate act of threading the needle. They could not simply shove the massive steel lifting cables through the hole. These cables, known as grommets, were several inches thick and weighed tons on their own. Instead, they started with a messenger wire, a thin, flexible steel cable. The diver on one side of the hull would push the messenger wire through the mud tunnel to a colleague waiting on the other side. Once the connection was made, the winch on the surface barge would pull the messenger wire, which in turn pulled a slightly thicker cable, which eventually pulled the massive lifting sling into position. They had to repeat this death-defying process multiple times along the length of the hull. One sling forward, one amidships, one aft. Each tunnel weakened the clay foundation slightly. Each vibration from the water lance risked triggering the chemical detonators in the torpedoes. The salvage master on the surface monitored the inclinometers on the wreck with obsessive precision. If the angle of the boat changed by even a fraction of a degree, it meant the hull was settling and the divers had to evacuate immediately. After days of grueling labor in the freezing dark, the lattice of steel was finally in place. Heavy lifting cables now cradled the U-boat like a sleeping child in a basket. The divers ascended to their decompression stops, leaving the silent wreck wrapped in steel. The physical connection between the surface and the deep was established. Now, the baton passed from the divers to the hydraulic engineers. The pumps on the sheer legs barge Hebe-2 began to whine, taking up the slack. The cables went taut, humming like bass strings. The easy part was over. Now they had to see if the ship would hold together, or if the ocean would claim it one last time. 1,800 tons. That was the number staring back at the salvage master from the digital load cells on the bridge of the Hebe-2. It was a mathematical impossibility that terrified the engineers. The U-534, even with its flooded compartments and heavy machinery, had a calculated submerged weight of roughly 1,200 tons. The crane was currently pulling with enough force to lift a destroyer, yet the submarine had not moved a single inch. The cables, massive braided steel lines thick as a man's thigh, were singing in the wind, vibrating with a terrifying harmonic frequency. They were stretched taut, storing potential energy like giant rubber bands. This was the most dangerous moment of any salvage operation, the breakout. The blue clay of the Kattegat was exacting its final price. The mud had created such a perfect seal around the hull that the water could not get underneath it to equalize the pressure. The salvage team was not just fighting gravity, they were fighting the weight of the entire ocean pressing down on the vacuum beneath the keel. The structural crisis was immediate and invisible. The hull of the U-534 was designed to withstand external pressure pushing inward, compressing the steel ribs. It was not designed to withstand extreme longitudinal tension. With the crane pulling up at 3 points and the mud pulling down along the entire length of the keel, the submarine was being subjected to a massive shearing force. The 50-year-old rivets were screaming. If the hull snapped now, the violence of the fracture would be catastrophic. The sudden release of tension would cause the massive steel cables to whip back toward the barge with supersonic speed, slicing through the crane's superstructure like a hot knife through butter. And inside the hull, the T-11 torpedoes were shifting. The immense tension was warping the frame of the boat, potentially pinching the torpedo tubes. If a warhead was crushed or if the friction of the bending steel generated enough heat, the chemical detonators could initiate. The salvage master had a binary choice: increase the power and risk tearing the ship in half, or hold the tension and pray. He chose the latter. He ordered the winch operators to lock the drums. They would play a high-stakes game of static waiting. The plan was to maintain the massive tension, pulling just below the breaking point of the cables and wait for nature to do the work. They needed pore water to slowly seep through the dense clay and infiltrate the space between the keel and the seabed. It was a microscopic invasion. As the water crept in, it would slowly equalize the pressure, destroying the vacuum seal from the edges inward. For hours, the barge sat motionless on the gray swell of the Kattegat. The crew walked softly, as if their footsteps might disturb the delicate equilibrium. The only sound was the groaning of the crane's hydraulics and the wind whistling through the tensioned wires. It was a standoff between Dutch engineering and the prehistoric mud. Then the physics shifted. It didn't happen with a roar, but with a shudder that vibrated through the steel deck of the barge. The load cell numbers flickered. The tension dropped suddenly from 1,800 tons to 1,600. The vacuum had failed. Water had rushed into the void. The grip of the clay was broken. Far below, the U-534 lurched upward, freed from her muddy grave. The cable slackened for a fraction of a second before snapping tight again, catching the hull as it swung free in the water column. The structural crisis was over, but the danger had simply changed form. The beast was awake, and now it had to be brought through the lethal transition zone to the surface. The ascent of a submarine from the seabed is a battle against the laws of thermodynamics. As the U-534 began to rise from the 200-foot depth, the salvage team faced a new enemy. Boyle's law. This fundamental principle of physics dictates that as pressure decreases, the volume of a gas increases. The hull of the U-boat was not solid steel. It was a complex honeycomb of compartments, some flooded with water, others trapping pockets of air that had been compressed for half a century. As the crane lifted the vessel through the water column, the external water pressure dropped with every foot of ascent. The trapped air inside the hull began to expand violently. This created a dangerous positive feedback loop. The more the air expanded, the more water it displaced from the hull. The more water it displaced, the lighter and more buoyant the submarine became. If the crane operators were not careful, the 1,200-ton load they were lifting would suddenly become a buoyant balloon, rocketing toward the surface faster than the winches could reel in the slack. A runaway ascent would be fatal. The submarine would breach the surface like a breaching whale, smash back down, and likely snap the lifting cables or detonate the sensitive torpedoes. The ascent speed was throttled to inches per minute. The engineers on the barge monitored the tension gauges with surgical focus. They had to constantly adjust the lift pressure to compensate for the changing buoyancy. It was a delicate dance of hydraulics, balancing the dead weight of the steel against the increasing lift of the expanding gases. The U-boat was effectively alive, groaning and shifting as the pressure released its grip on the rivets. At a depth of 40 feet, the ghostly shape became visible too, the divers waiting in the support boats. It was a dark, looming shadow rising from the green gloom of the Kattegat. The water around the hull boiled with escaping bubbles, the breath of the machine finally being released. The anticipation on the surface was electric. For 48 years, this vessel had been a legend, a rumor, a set of coordinates on a chart. Now it was becoming physical matter again. Then, the moment of resurrection arrived. On August 23, 1993, the surface of the sea began to churn. White foam erupted as the massive conning tower broke the interface between water and air. The water cascaded off the steel in distinctive sheets, revealing the sharp, predatory lines of the Type 9's winter garden. It did not look like a wreck. Thanks to the anaerobic conditions of the blue clay, the steel was not a rusted hulk. It was still painted in its original Kriegsmarine gray, preserved in a time capsule of mud. The silence of the ocean was broken by the roar of water draining from the free flood holes along the deck. The U-534 had returned. She hung there, suspended in the slings of the Hebe-2, dripping with the slime of the bottom. The smell that hit the salvage crew was visceral, a mixture of diesel oil, rotting seaweed, and the stale, metallic scent of history. But the triumph was muted by caution. As the massive hull stabilized on the surface, the explosive ordnance disposal team moved in. The boat was now in an environment it was never meant to inhabit. The open air, suspended by wires, the change in pressure and temperature could still trigger the crystallized explosives in the torpedo tubes. The salvage master watched as the hull settled into the pontoon cradle. They had cheated gravity and physics. They had stolen a Leviathan from the deep. But the final question remained. What was inside? The hatches were still sealed tight, guarding the darkness within. The moment a salvage team breaches the hull of a sunken warship is usually defined by a rush of foul air. But when the technicians finally cracked the seals on the U-534, they were met with something stranger. The mundane silence of a tomb that had been waiting for inspection for half a century. The treasure hunters, led by the Danish millionaire Karsten Ree, who had funded the millions required for the lift, were waiting for the glint of gold bullion. The rumors had been persistent. They claimed the U-534 was carrying the lost reserves of the Reich, or perhaps the personal wealth of high-ranking fugitives fleeing to South America. But as the teams moved through the claustrophobic corridors, stepping over the debris of 1945, the reality set in. There were no chests of gold. There were no paintings by old masters. The cargo holds were packed with the prosaic, desperate supplies of a submarine on a one-way trip. They found crates of cheap wine, stacks of condoms meant for a crew expecting shore leave in a foreign land, and piles of rotting uniforms. The gold was a myth, a fabrication born from the silence of the sea. To the investors, it was a financial disaster. To the historians, however, the hull was a diamond mine. The true value of U-534 lay in her technical preservation. Buried in the oxygen-starved clay, the submarine had escaped the ravages of oxidation that turned most wrecks into rust piles. In the radio space, the recovery teams found cryptographic material, and among the artifacts later reported were 2 Enigma machines, not cinematic treasure, but a forensic link to the War of Signals. They offered a physical connection to the intelligence war that had defined the 20th century. Yet the most significant discovery was also the most lethal. In the torpedo tubes, the EOD teams confirmed the presence of the T-11 Zaunkönig torpedoes. These were the pinnacle of Nazi underwater engineering, weapons that guided themselves by listening to the cavitation of enemy propellers. Recovering them was a terrifying exercise in ballistics disposal. The warheads were extracted with the delicacy of brain surgery, neutralized and removed. For the first time, Western engineers could study the guidance systems of these weapons in perfect condition, revealing just how close the Battle of the Atlantic had come to tipping in the other direction. The mystery of Commander Nolau's final orders, however, remained stubbornly unsolved. The 2 tons of paper documents found on board had been turned into a sodden pulp by the seawater. Whatever specific orders he was carrying, whatever reason compelled him to ignore the surrender and run the gauntlet of the RAF, had dissolved into the chemistry of the ocean. The dead crew took their secret to the grave, leaving only the machine behind as a witness. Today, the U-534 does not sit in a scrapyard, nor does she rest in the dark. She was transported to Birkenhead, England, across the river from Liverpool, the very port she would have hunted in 1945. To display her, the engineers made a radical decision. They used diamond wire cutters to divide the hull into 5 sections, 2 of which were later rejoined, so it could be transported and displayed in section form. This was not vandalism, it was an autopsy. The section display was designed to let visitors see inside the boat's compartments without needing to enter the hull itself. They can see the cramped reality of the engine room, the claustrophobic nightmare of the torpedo bays, and the fragility of the pressure hull that stood between the crew and the crushing deep. She is the only Type 9 C-40 in the world on display. She stands as a monument not to the ideology of the regime that built her, but to the cold, hard physics of naval warfare. She is a testament to the engineering audacity required to build a machine that could survive the pressure of the abyss and the equal audacity required to drag it back to the surface 48 years later. The gold was a lie, but the steel was real.